I'm Andrew Kwan, founder and director of Andrew Kwan Artist Management, an agency representing classical instrumentalists here in Canada and abroad. I'm here today being interviewed by host Mako on Talking Blues.
Andrew, I need to find out how music first came into your life.
I am of Chinese descent. I am an immigrant here in Canada, originally from Hong Kong, and as part of many Asian families, I studied music. I studied piano, was my instrument. I was very fortunate to attend a music school here in Toronto called St. Michael's Choir School. The choir school has produced many international superstars, everywhere from anyone from Stuart Goodyear to Michael Sade, Matt Dusk, Kevin Hearn of the Bare Naked Ladies. I was part of that training, and I knew that music always had to be a part of my life. But being from a Chinese family, my parents always felt that I had to do something a little bit more secure, and they wanted me to go into business. So the passion of music, specifically that of Western European classical music, I managed to find a wonderful balance between business and music in the role of an artist manager.
Interesting. So, when did you start playing music? I know your mom taught you initially.
Yeah, that's right. I started at the age of 5, little piano lessons from my mother, and then when I attended this choir school, every student attending had to take piano lessons. So I started with the piano teachers that were available at the choir school.
And when I hear choir school, it automatically conjures up an image of people singing. Are you a singer as well?
Correct. Yes, I am. I sang in the choir for the 11 years. The school was a special school in that it ran back in aging myself from grade 3 to 13. Ontario had grade 13 back in those days. And so we were responsible to provide music to the cathedral here in Toronto. It's St. Michael's Cathedral. Every student was part of one of 4 choirs that provided Sunday music for the cathedral.
Do you know, when you start so early at the age of 5, was there a moment where you realized that you were passionate about music as opposed to it being something that you did because your parents told you to?
I think that's a perpetual struggle with all parents. There is that level in which, yes, it was painful. A lot of discipline actions from my parents, forcing me to practice 15 minutes to 30 minutes every day, and moving forward. I think especially with music lessons, a lot of parents have forgotten. I do a parallel with hockey parents.
Right.
If I said to a hockey parent that you would never allow your kids to watch a hockey game, or to, many parents will save a lot of money and take them to the Maple Leafs or take them to the Marlies here in Toronto, and they actually see excellent players. And every child who picks up a hockey stick will have that 7th game Stanley Cup scenario in their mind, be it Mario Lemieux, be it McDavid, be it Wayne Gretzky back in our days. They have that scenario play that they're on a breakaway, they shoot, they score. Sometimes with music lessons and young families or young kids who are taking it, the exercise for them is often just the weekly piano lesson, violin lesson, and parents forget to take their kids to see concerts. Mm-hmm. So as a result, the only inspiration is their music teacher, and music teachers are fantastic, and I think there's a very special place in heaven for any music teacher. But at the same time, I think it's, for me, I was very fortunate that my parents did take me to the symphony concerts, to recitals, and I saw, wow, that's what a piano can sound like. Doesn't sound like that when I'm practicing. So there was a bit of inspiration, and then being in a choir where the level of excellence was very high. it inspired me to continue. So yes, there were challenges, and as a kid in high school, you wanted to go out after class and do something else, but I always knew I had to get home and practice. I was fortunate to have some level of talent, and which required that I practice. It got to the points where I was doing an hour and a half daily, 2 hours a day, and it's a balance. So.
You also got your ARCT,
Correct.
Which is no easy feat, I understand.
Yeah.
When did you get that?
When I was 17, 18. And then I was always impressed with letters behind one's name, and so after that I did in the Toronto Royal Conservatory of Music system at that time. The highest level was the Associate of the Royal Conservatory. The ARCT stood for Royal Conservatory of Toronto back in those days. And after that, I pursued 2 more diplomas through the London, UK's examination system, the Trinity College of London, and I did my license and fellowship through them as well.
Okay, so if your parents thought or didn't tell you to go into something more than music or go into business, were you good enough to pursue piano as a profession?
I don't know.
Did you ever consider it?
Yes, for sure.
Okay.
For sure. I guess going to university, my priorities and interests changed a bit. Being in a new environment, meeting new people. The choir school was a very small private school, so some of my schoolmates I started with in grade 3 went wire to wire into grade 13, and then I went to York University here in Toronto, and I met new friends, and at that point the idea of having to practice 3 hours, 4 hours a day was not as interesting at that point. So
right.
I knew what it took. I knew in order to make it into even not so much a solo performance career. There, most people think as an instrumentalist, you're that single soloist standing on stage. Chamber music or collaborative pianist takes a lot of work, and I just at that time didn't feel the urge to pursue that lifestyle.
But you still played.
Correct. On weekends at the choir school, we had an opportunity, if you reached a certain level in piano performance, had the ability to study the church organ, the church pipe organ, and as one of the better piano students at a very young age, I got to page turn for the organist at the cathedral, and it was like, standing, second in command to the Starship Enterprise, and seeing these stops and these 3 manual keyboard on a pipe, and the monstrosity, the beauty of the sound, the power of the organ, it really affected me, and so I pursued pipe organ, and I'm fortunate to this day that I still float around Toronto occasionally, helping out my friends who, it's like, oh, Andrew, I need to take my kids on a hockey tournament weekend. Can you cover for me? So I still play the pipe organ.
Okay, so somebody calls you and says, okay, I'm not going to be available next Sunday. Can you cover for me? Is it easy for you to just go in and know what to play and how to play it? Is there rehearsal involved?
Sometimes if there's a singer, so there's a quick rehearsal involved.
Right.
They call me because they know I'm of a certain level. I confess that it sounds like a church interview. I admit that that I have a set of repertoire that I have in my back pocket, and so the prelude, the postludes, I can pull from there. And in the Catholic service, there's standard hymns, not standard. There's a few hymn books, and at this point, whichever denomination, I can tackle basically any hymns that are required. So it's not that challenging.
Do you have an organ at home?
No.
Oh, you don't. So practice means having to go to the church.
Yes. So as a student of organ back when I started at the age of 12. That was another commitment because you did not have a organ at home. After school, I would go to a church near my house and practice 45 minutes and then make another trip home. So it was quite a commitment back in those days.
You were talking about page turning. Every time I watch somebody do that, I always get so nervous for them. Because I can, like, they make it look easy, but I can imagine there's a lot of pressure and making sure that you do it right, turn it at the right time, don't flip the page and drop it.
Right.
Any nightmarish stories?
Ironically, my nightmare story was as an organist, and it was one of those. It was obviously before the days of the iPad Pro, and ironically, I know a lot of my colleagues who, it's an expensive piece of equipment to have, and
Right.
as an organist, many have not flipped over because with an organ, you're also controlling the foot pedals.
Right.
So you don't actually have a spot to put your page turning pedal on the organ. So a lot of my colleagues have not flipped over to the iPad Pro yet. It was a piece that I was learning. I was playing for one of I think it was the Easter services, and I knew there were a few tricky page turns, so I had some extra photocopied pages on the organ desk, as they call it, and sure enough, in one of the page turns, they knocked over the spare pages, and so it's. But I take pride when I have to turn pages, and I guess as a pianist, you sort of learn how to follow. When I'm turning pages for a pianist who's collaborating with a violinist. You can't get in trouble if you're trying to follow the piano line, especially if you don't know the piece of repertoire. So you follow the easier line, the violin line, and it's much easier. And you want to give the confidence to the pianist that you're aware that a page turn is coming up. So normally in that situation, I get up and I have my finger on the page, and so the artist knows, the pianist knows that I'm ready to turn. Sometimes they want the page turned a little quicker, so they'll nod to me. Otherwise, most of the time they know that I'm on top of it. So,
yeah. Well, I always get nervous for the page turner when I watch them. So you go to school, you decide you want to follow or study music. I just study economics and business. At what point do you decide I want to work in the music industry, and how does that decision come about?
After university, I actually worked for a financial firm as an entry-level analyst, and it was sort of your standard 6-month probation, and after my 6 months, my manager at that time sort of took me me aside and said, I can't fault you. You do your work. You're here on time. You put in your effort. Everything's correct, but you're not happy, are you? And I said, no, I thought this was my dream career path. I said, I really can't stand it. And by that time, I as part of that job, I went and did my fellowship of the Canadian Securities Institute. So, I was a certified stocks and bonds. Could I have sold them? I don't know. But I was, in that game. I went back to my piano teacher. So this was after the choir school. I started studying with a wonderful piano teacher in Toronto. Rest in peace, Miss Bojana Tojic. And Bojana just passed away a couple years ago. But I was staying in touch with her. And by that time, I'd finished my fellowship in piano performance. And at that time, the conservatory was starting this new program, and which has now forayed into the Glenn Gould School. Mm-hmm. I forget the name of the school back then. It was like these special programs, and it was sort of a post-university type special program. And they had a stream called the Artist Teacher Diploma. It was a 2-year program, and I went to see the academic lead at that time, a wonderful mentor of mine who I still occasionally get in touch with, Dr. Cam Trousdale, and he sort of read my resume and he said, "Do you want to perform?" And at that point, I was pretty clear I did not want to perform. And he said, "Do you want to teach?" And I have no interest in teaching piano lessons. He said, based on your resume and your experience, would you like a job? And I said, hey, that sounds interesting. So he managed to design a management trainee position for me at the Royal Conservatory, and at that point it was very fascinating. It was sort of the whole concept of arts administration was a new, it was obviously around every orchestra had a general manager, every orchestra has the administrative side, as would an opera company, ballet company, museums, etc. But the idea of formulating a job in the stream called arts administration was still relatively new. I remember probably 4 or 5 years advance of that, University of Waterloo was the first to develop a program called Bachelor of Arts Administration. So this was still very new in the industry, and I sort of said, sure, let's give this a try, and I was there for a 1-year management trainee program, and then the idea of going to arts management or artist management presented itself, and I took the leap, and here I am.
Okay, so obviously you found it more enjoyable than what you were doing in the financial side of things. In that year, what was it about that role that appealed to you?
I've always been interested in the operations of things. Be it, I walk into a restaurant. Of course, I love the food, but I'm also counting how many people are coming to the restaurant. I'm trying to figure out the average, meal cost for everybody. I'm checking on how many, wait staff they have and how many tables each wait staff would have over the course of a night. So I've always been interested in the operations of things, and as a result of that, I think the idea of understanding how an arts organization worked was very appealing to me. So
what did you hope to get out of that 1 year, and what did you get out of that 1 year?
It was a very, at that time, my position was supported through an Ontario Arts Council grant called Arts Management Trainee Program, and they sort of put me through the different divisions, different departments of the Royal Conservatory. Granted, back then the administration of the conservatory is nothing compared to today. Mm-hmm. That organization has grown, 20-fold. But to me, it was I enjoyed this. I guess the stability of the job, so to speak. It was your administrative position. It was a 9 to 5. I enjoyed learning as to how an organization, even like the Royal Conservatory, had a revenue side that had to support the expense side. So all of that was very fascinating.
But were you hoping to represent classical musicians, or were you thinking maybe an orchestra or art school, or?
I wasn't sure. I was young enough that you hear the TikTok philosophers today, in your 20s, go out and make all your mistakes and just, try things. And I guess at that point, I was fortunate that, if it didn't work out, I could still maybe get a job with an orchestra or with a museum. Obviously my love was classical music, so I would be hoping that I'd find a job within classical music organizations. I wasn't sure what I was, and the conservatory would have offered me a position somewhere within the organization. So I wasn't really sure.
I wonder when the person asked you if you wanted to be a musician, and you said, "Oh no, I don't want to be a performing musician." By that time, had you had enough exposure to performing that, what was it made you say that that's not what you want to do?
In the course of my training, I had done a few recitals, solo recitals, and I knew how much work it was to carry that amount of repertoire. Mm-hmm. And I knew that, at that time I enjoyed reading a lot as well, and you read the autobiographies of some of the legends of the piano, and just to realize how much repertoire that they had under their belt at any given time. And I still think about the wonderful artists that I work with on a daily basis, and they have 20 concertos in their fingertips, and they have how many number of recital programs available, and I knew I wasn't there. I knew for me to get there was a huge commitment, and at the end of the day, I just, that wasn't what I would find fulfilling at that point.
So, do you start your company right away, or do you go through somebody else first before you start?
I was with a partner at that time, and we started together. And then the partner decided to leave, and that was it.
So, tell me about the idea when you first started. What you hoped to achieve? What was the goal?
The goal still remains the same, and it's the promotion and development of classical instrumentalists. We at one time did have a roster of singers as well, though I would imagine that my knowledge of operatic roles is decent, but understanding it to the point of being a good manager, I think required a higher level of knowledge. So my strength was instrumental repertoire, and that's the roster that I primarily work with, instrumental ensembles and soloists. And at that point, and like I said, to current day, it is the development, the marketing, the career advice of artists, and in doing so, hopefully engage them in public performance. And understanding their trajectory of a career, and that it is I think of some of the greats pianists or great classical artists who have recently passed. Leon Fleischer, he passed at the age of 92, and he started performing at the age of 19. That's this is not your flash in the pan career of 10 years, and where are they today? So understanding that that is a life journey, that part has always appealed to me.
We had the pleasure of working with Leon Fleischer. What an incredible man.
Incredible knowledge. Right.
So when you decided to go out on your own and start your company, how easy was it to establish that business? Or approach an artist and say, hey, I'd like to represent you. And I don't know what the lay of the land was, and if there was a lot of competition back then, but how easy was it to get off the ground your business?
There's obviously instability in any new businesses. There's a shortfall of classical musician agencies here in Canada. From when I started to today, it's actually quite frightening. When I remember finding an old directory and just doing a quick count. Back when I had started, there were 16 instrumental classical rosters in Canada, and today there's really just 4 of us. I wish I could say that my world dominance took over and knocked them out of business, but unfortunately, it's a very challenging business, and over time, many of them retired. Many of them just didn't want to pursue it, and in the structure of our business, it's also difficult because of the cycle of bookings. Right now, here we are in January 2024, and we're confirming dates for 24-25. We're starting conversations for the concert season 2025-26. So as a new business that's based on a commission revenue, you're not going to see payments until sometimes 8 months, 16 months, 24 months.
Wow.
And so can a new company sustain itself? Which again, it's no different than from any other industry. People, why there's been question about this statistic, but they say that 80% of new restaurants go bankrupt in the first year.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that calculation is that people figure, okay, renovation, startup, opening day, it's going to cost me $1 million. They don't realize that you need another $500,000 to carry it for that first year. And if you're not making that money, you go bankrupt. So with our business, again, I was fortunate that my personal life at that time was not too expensive. I could afford to sort of maintain a minimal revenue, personal revenue, to start the company, and so I was able to weather out that first 16, 18 months.
Do you remember a moment where you thought the company had gotten to a place where you wanted it to be? I know it's an ongoing thing, but as somebody who started up with nothing and starting a company from scratch, was there a moment where you signed somebody or you did something that was a milestone to you?
I was very fortunate, and people that you've worked with, I was very fortunate the early days of my company that I had some outstanding artists. My early days, I worked with St. Lawrence String Quartet. And ironically, as I mentioned, I did have a vocal roster. Back in those days, Toronto was filled with musicals, and I had 5 singers in musicals, and with those contracts, we did get we received commission from those, so that sort of helped keep a revenue for the company in the early days. It wasn't a big amount, but it was enough to keep the office and the lights turned on, so to speak. But I had some, the St. Lawrence String Quartet. After I started working with them for the first year, they won the Banff String Quartet competition, and in that time I had some other artists. There was an outstanding Czech-Canadian pianist by the name of Anton Kubalik, who, rest in peace, he passed away 5-6 years ago. Beautiful pianist. We had a piano duo team. So I was very fortunate to have represented myself well, and the artists who I worked with trusted me. And the company sort of grew in a comfortable size that I can handle. Of course, my saying is I could have a roster of 30 artists or 50 artists. I would rather have 5 artists doing 50 concerts than 50 artists doing 5 concerts. Right. So I was very comfortable keeping a good balance of the size of my company that I could feel comfortable working with.
How would the Canadian classical music scene be viewed outside of Canada? I mean, you mentioned St. Lawrence String Quartet, who are world-renowned. You work with the Griffin, who are world-class. But in general, how respected or how was the Canadian classical musical scene viewed by people in Europe or people outside of North America?
I think in recent years, we've sort of skyrocketed a bit with the recent international piano competition wins, and we've always been here. Part of the challenge with Canada is, as we all know, the geography of Canada. It's so big, and it's not a very big population, so the opportunities are a little bit less. As a result of that, unless you are very willing to understand the Canadian cultural landscape, people sort of skip over Canada. They see Canada as the 6 major cities, and that's it. Fast forward to today, where the competitiveness for classical music opportunity has increased drastically. I think the world is noticing a little bit more about the Canadians and what is available here in Canada. So I don't think I guess it's sort of true not just for classical music, but for sports and for academics. there's more opportunities when it's a country of 330 million. So the brain drain issue, of course, even if we look at the number of universities that can offer a position, there's just way more colleges and universities in the U.S. So it's challenging, but I don't think anyone thinks of Canada as a barren wasteland of culture. It's just not big enough for them to invest the time into really paying attention.
So when we last talked, you talked about you're both an agent and a manager.
Yes.
Can you talk about agent? I understand you would be going out looking for performance opportunities or fielding calls for performance opportunities for your roster. Tell me what your role is as a manager for these artists.
Strangely, in the world of classical music, most agents wear both hats as agent manager. In indie bands and in global music and pop music, there's often two people, sometimes even two separate companies that one does management, the other does booking agent. The role of a manager in classical music, I need to be aware of repertoire. I need to see how that repertoire fits into a potential engagement. It's my role to advise the artist that, you're going to play in Sarnia, Ontario. I don't think you can do that repertoire. So I have to have a basic understanding of that repertoire. I have to have an understanding of what the artists do have available in their fingertips. There's classical music has such a vast library of music that it's not often the artist will carry all of that all the time. Mm-hmm. So I have to be sensitive to that aspect. I have to figure out within that role how to take that opportunity and flourish it as well. So the role of manager often doesn't come with direct revenue, but it's equally important for the trajectory of the artist's career.
And how open are artists when you say, I don't think you should be playing that. You should maybe think about this.
It's a balancing. Mm-hmm. I jokingly say to friends that I have a young family, 8 and 4, and it's like I've had 3 decades of babysitting experience. It's at the same time I don't want the artist to be playing ABBA cover tunes, mm-hmm. Arranged for string quartet or arranged for violin piano. They have to feel that what they're doing is artistically and has integrity, and their programs push their artistic development as well. But at the same time, they have to be sensitive, and I guess that's the role of a manager, is to understand the concert organization, the community where that concert organization is taking place, understand what type of series that concert organization is. Definitely historically, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, the Western European classical music art form was the backbone of concert activities across Canada. Be it Port Hope, be it in Snow Lake, Manitoba, in Terrace, British Columbia. If there was a concert series, the lion's share of presentation was that of classical music. Fast forward to today, where we live in a very diverse ethnic country, interests have changed. Those concert series are still there, but their priorities have changed a bit. Of course, the social-political priorities this country is not facing, but celebrating. Things like that have changed the concert presenting landscape drastically, and understanding that people are not attending a straight up classical music recital. So those concert series that used to present 5 of their 7 concerts. Yes, we live in a Toronto here, and we look at examples of Kerner Hall and Music Toronto and TO Live, and we see the vast numbers of classical music presentations and the number of presentations overall. I think that Kerner presents 80 shows a year. That is not the norm across this country. I've worked in communities like Estevan, Saskatchewan, or La Ronge, Saskatchewan, and these are the grassroots volunteer organizations that go door to door, putting up posters and asking the bank for a $50 donation and things like that. And their concert series have changed, and sometimes they do no classical music in a season, and they present a country and western, they present a family show, they present a jazz concert, and they present a folk group. Well, for a classical musician to walk in there and do 2 hours of contemporary music is quite challenging for that audience, and in this day and age, we have to be very sensitive to the ticket buying audiences, and that's an area which, as a manager, I've and as a lecturer, I've been doing a bit of research on, and I love using the example of this little group called the Rolling Stones. Rolling Stones can sell out 60,000 seats in 48 hours. If you look at historically their set list, they will always start off with Jumping Jack Flash, I Get No Satisfaction, some of their all-time hits right off the top to get the audiences, the crowds, wowed and excited. And then they'll do some new pieces from the new album, and if they have an intermission, they'll always do another one that brings people back. This is a group that has equal longevity to that of Leon Fleischer, Malcolm Press. They're some of the superstars of classical music. Yet they know how to program their shows to bring their audiences into an apex and et cetera, et cetera. So all that to say, as a manager, I try to explain that to the artists, that, hey, you're walking into a concert series that has had no classical music for the past year. You cannot play that piece. What else do you have in your repertoire? I don't want them to do Pachelbel canon and Vivaldi Four Seasons all the time, but there's there's so much repertoire out there, and most of my artists respect that. As a manager and as their agent, my best interest is for their success. So I'm not doing this to soapbox and prove them that I'm the agent's better. It's so that they're liked, and the success of our business is not that of first engagements, it's that of repeat engagements. Meaning, as an agent side, I can wax poetic and sell an artist, but if you do things that they don't like out there, you'll never be asked back.
Right.
So and I'm fortunate that I look on my roster and the number of artists which continue to return back to concert series and festivals because they are liked, because they play pieces that people want to hear.
I wonder, the Canadian classical music landscape, or more like the opportunities, has that changed greatly over the time that you've been in business, which is over 30 years?
Indeed.
Are there more opportunities or less?
I think, the backbone of touring was the dedication and diligence of these amazing volunteers and communities across Canada. People who, I think about the name Women's Musical Club of Toronto, who last year or the year before celebrated their 100th year. And they are not the longest running one. Actually, the one in Brantford, the Women's Musical Club there, started 3 years before the Toronto one did. And if we think about society back then, it's not a bias or a statement, but at that time, the father went to work, the mother was at home, and hence the title Women's Musical Club, because a lot of these organizations started by the the women who were not working. And they were the ones who baked the cookies and the muffins for intermission and the post concerts. All that has changed, and I know that volunteerism overall in Canada has changed. Not just Canada, around the world, globally. So these organizations are finding it harder and harder to survive, and as a result of that, the their priorities of what is attractive for ticket sales have changed. Selling classical music has never been easy. It is not something for the masses. It never was and never will be. We hope it. Obviously, as someone who cares and loves the music, it would be great if it was as popular as Taylor Swift, but it's not. So it takes a very specialized energy to make it happen. Yes, in the past 30, 40 years, the number of opportunities have decreased drastically. Where it has flourished is the artists' initiatives to develop festivals. Those have become much more specialized and stronger. And so on one side, the numbers have decreased, but where they do get to play have become much more successful. So I guess that's a bit of the trade-off.
Right. In your roster, I know a lot of the musicians, I don't know, I shouldn't say a lot, but some of the musicians teach. And so it's not like they're gigging full time. Or they will do other things within the classical music world to compensate their work. Is it possible for Canadian classical musicians to just work in Canada and make a decent living? Or do they have to go outside? Do they have to go into the States? Do they have to go to Europe or Asia?
I think, yes, and that holds true with all aspects of business and be it in performance, be it, we talked about even grocery stores, and grocery stores at one time sold bread and butter, and now they're involved in, they lobby to get the liquor license to sell wines and beers, but prior to that, they're selling clothes, they're selling banking services, they're selling televisions, and for we know that they are supporters of the arts and the Weston Foundation. Loblaws then made a big play and bought out Shoppers Drug Mart. So everyone is multi-revenue streaming. The ability to be a one-trick pony, as I call it, I think is very hard. I think perhaps there's some international superstars who don't take on an academic career. But here in Canada, simply because the opportunities are not there and the cost to fulfill those opportunities are quite high. If you were to just do the major cities of Canada, you're only doing 10 concerts a year.
Right.
And in the cycle of re-engagement, you're probably not often asked back the immediate season after. So it's a 2-3 year cycle. And if that's the case, then what are you doing for 2-3 years in between? And simply the cost is definitely post-pandemic. We've all seen rising costs in travel and car rental and in hotels. So it becomes very strenuous to be a performing artist. So as a result of that, most Canadian artists have secondary revenue, activities. Teaching academics is definitely one of them. Arts administration, a number of artists now run festivals as artistic directors, executive directors. So some of them have gone into the tech and sound side of the industry. I think it's just needed in the evolution of artists. It's ironic that the joke as an actor is how many actors worked at that restaurant. It holds true in many industries.
I noticed on your roster, and I've interviewed a few of these people. You have a number of very young artists. How do you
Yes.
go about selecting an artist? Is it something they come to you and then it pique your interest, or is it something you're always looking out for and you're looking for a certain thing?
Ah, I'm very fortunate that over the course of my career as an agent and manager, I obviously have developed a lot of close friends and acquaintances. Over the years, if an emerging artist based in Alberta performs with the concert presenter in Calgary or in Edmonton, and they realize that they are dealing with the artist directly, not through an agent, and then they sort of ask the artists at the concert, "Oh, have you thought of an agent?" Or and then a day later, 2 days later, I'll get a phone call or an email. "Hey, Andrew, I just presented so and so." So I have those type of connections that I hear of emerging young artists. On my roster, I have two faculty of music deans. I have numerous instrument chairs. Before, my wife used to run the highest level of, I don't want to call it amateur, but because some of those, a national music competition called the Canadian Music Competition. So I keep my networks and ears out there. A lot of my clients over the years have sat on juries at Montreal competition and the different competitions. So I hear of emerging young artists. From there, I will always try to make it a point to go hear them and see them live. It's challenging. I think one of the best examples would be a professional hockey team or football team. You may have the athletic statistics, but you may not be the marquee player. And so, even in classical music, there is a level of artistic excellence that is my baseline. I obviously want someone who is amazing, but then I have to see their stage presence, their charisma, their capability to talk at a reception. I like to meet with them and see where their mind space is. Are they going to be one that says, "I don't care that I'm playing in Estevan, Saskatchewan, or in Flin Flon. I want to play this program." I want to see that they understand the marketplace, and before I sign them. And I've been very fortunate that most of my artists, as I said, I respect their artistic capability. They respect that I know the marketplace as well. So yes, emerging young artists is something that I always keep an eye on. I also am fortunate that I teach at the two institutions here in Toronto, the Glenn Gould School and the University of Toronto. So I'm aware of the competition winners. It's somewhere filed in the back of my head, and I see where they're going with their career before, if I want to make a play for them, or most often they come knocking on my door.
So competition's a big part of classical music. Is it really important? Can a classical musician succeed without entering competitions to establish their name?
Yes. Yes. In a very competitive marketplace today, who won the 5 major piano competitions? Not recently, but 2 competitions ago. Unfortunately, we tend to forget. There's obviously the hype, and as winners of any major competition, you have the immediate winners, accolade performances. The most important part is, how do you parlay that into a career? So yes, winning competition definitely helps, but it's not the only answer to develop. And there's been many competition winners whose careers have not taken off afterwards as well. So it's a very intricate and sensitive jigsaw puzzle that you're balancing to put the whole overall picture together.
Okay, so a number of years ago, I attended a classical music festival, and it was my first one, and I was kind of taken aback by the number of older aged audience members. And I spoke to somebody at the festival and said, is this a concern that the audience base seems to be quite a lot older than other genres of music? And they said, this has been something they've been talking about forever, but for some reason, people reach a certain age and go to classical music so that they seem to maintain this older audience, even though some people might not get into classical music until later on in their lives. They come to it at that point. Is that still the case?
Yes, but the challenge is that I think in the 40s, 50s, 60s, where, there were older people in the 40s, 50s, 60s as well, the exposure to classical music was already inherent through their life. So when they hit the age of 55 and assume that their personal lives was capable of going out at night, for you don't see a lot of young families because, as a parent, on a Wednesday night, you're worried about what lunch they're going to have tomorrow. You got to make sure their homework's done. The idea of going to the symphony that night is much more challenging. The difficulty I feel and I see is that classical music was not as the exposure to classical music was not as inherent as it was back in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Here in Canada, we used to have a national radio network whose priority was classical music, and to the point where some of the orchestras in the cities was started by the CBC. It was the CBC Radio Orchestra. And then when CBC pulled out, that orchestra managed to survive and become sort of the civic orchestra of that town. The last CBC orchestra, which was out in Vancouver, I think packed up 12 years ago. So I am concerned that the exposure to classical music, so that when people hit that older age, may feel interested to attend, I think that's going to become a bit of an obstacle. Here in Canada, I love using this example to my students. How many people, when they turn 55 or 60, will wake up and turn to their partner and say, I really need to go watch a cricket game. I really need to go watch rugby. Simply put, these are two sports which, in different parts of the world, can fill an 80,000 seat stadium. Cities go to war because of the cricket tournament or the rugby tournament. Yet here in Canada, those are two sports that aren't often taught or exposed as part of the phys ed programs. And therefore, when you turn 55, are you going to say, oh, I'll spend $75 to buy a ticket to a cricket game? We're not getting that exposure in schools. And there was a time when churches, regardless of denomination, had great music. And I read a very sad statistic that 25% of churches across Canada will probably be closed in the next decade. People are not attending church. So where are they listening to music? And I've listened to podcasts and read articles of how the Alexas and the Spotifys and Apple Music has actually limited people's exposure to new music, because you're comfortable with saying, play me the best of my favorite 70s band, 80s band, 90s band, and you don't realize that there's a new band out there. So that's not even in classical music. That's the change of demographics and social activities and habits. So I think it is a bit of a concern. It's also a bit of a concern in the economics of classical music, for that matter, any art form. For people to become sponsors and donors, there has to be a relationship. And if you're a one-off user of that organization, there isn't that level of commitment to the organization. And so that part concerns me a bit. as to the financial structure of classical music, because we are not a populist type where we can play in a hall of 25,000 and make the business side of it work. Classical music continues to be a priority of government funding, ticket sales, and sponsored ownership. And how do we maintain that? How do we continue to find new money to support the arts?
I always find it interesting, though, that as in your roster, there's a lot of great young musicians coming up. And working with the RCM, we get to see a lot more coming up. So there's obviously, it's not to say all young people don't care about classical music. There's obviously some who do and who execute it quite well. What encourages you about classical music these days?
I think the model has changed. I think the model, the current model is, I don't want to say it's broken, but it has evolved. I think the opportunities are much greater than maintaining the infrastructure that I worked in for the past 30 years, that, I'm just looking for an organization to buy my artists. Today, because audiences are much willing to explore and experience different ways, I don't think we necessarily need the concert stage, you walk on to a platform that's 4.5 feet above the raked seating. People can experience music and arts in much different environments. And for the entrepreneurial emerging artists, that allows them so many new opportunities. Whereas 40 years ago, what do you mean you're playing in a warehouse? That's disgusting. But today it's like, wow, that's very cool. It's challenging in that here we are in 2024, and the majority of classical music concerts still start at 8 o'clock at night. Is classical music easier at 8 o'clock than at 5 o'clock? Is it easier than, is it more challenging at 11 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon? I think audiences and artists need to break that mold and realize, why is there a seniors early bird dinner in Florida? And that dinner is at 4:30.
Right.
If that is our audience base, why are we still providing classical music at 8 o'clock in a city of Toronto, where in February, the artists don't want to leave their house? Why can't we put it at 2 o'clock? Are the 2 o'clock concerts seen intrinsically less important? So I think the younger artists who receive their music through AirPods, through their laptops, whereas you and I have a hi-fi system back in the day. If we had the means, it would be a hi-fi room, and
right.
It was a sanctuary of sound. But all of that has changed. So for emerging young artists, I think there's way more opportunities to develop, and especially in classical music. Again, we seem to run different rules because it's classical music, but as an indie band, I live near the Danforth, and every so often I'll have lunch on the Danforth on a Thursday afternoon, and there's a Danforth Music Hall there, and I look at these names, and I personally don't recognize them, but there's a lineup at 2 in the afternoon for an evening show. The younger generation of artists need to be responsible for their own fan base. They need to figure out different environment to attract, and figure out how to connect with that fan base. And I think from that point of view, there's an endless opportunity. Whereas the model that I work in will face its challenges, and it has faced its challenges. Definitely post pandemic, there's new challenges that I didn't expect. And so that's sort of my, it gives me strength to know that when I'm lecturing to these university and conservatory students, that I tell them that, what your grandparents were used to is not what you're walking into. So be innovative, explore, think outside of the box. And those are some of the most successful series and successful performance opportunities.
My final question to you. You do a lot of things, like manage, be an agent. You do, as you said, you've done some lectures. What's your favorite thing? What gives you the greatest satisfaction in what you do, and what do you enjoy the most in what you get to do?
As I was coming up here, I was sort of thinking what type of questions and
Did I ask any good ones?
yeah, absolutely. They're all great. And one of the answers that I was preparing was, what makes an agent a manager, and I have some very dear friends who are agents and managers, and I think one of the common characteristics of all of us is that we are curious. We love to connect the dots. We love to make things happen. So from that point of view, things that excite me still is getting the engagement. Like in our office, we have this silly thing that when we nail down a concert, we scream out, "Give me a pow," and it means that we got a contract, and there's a wonderful feeling, and then from there, the ability to create a tour out of it. We get that, what we call an anchor date. So we fly into, say, Vancouver, and then we start designing little runouts, circuit from Vancouver to Kamloops to Kelowna over to Nelson, whatever it might be. And then, so that gives me excitement. And it still does, even after 30 years of getting that opportunity. And I guess knowing that at the end of the day, I was the conduit that gave the artists their platform, their soapbox, their stage to do what they love, which is sharing the music that they have perfected to an audience. That's always it fuels me. And going to where we bumped into each other again, at a concert at Music Toronto at the Jane Mallet, I sat in the last row, and I love sitting in the last row because I know the quality of what's happening on stage. They're my artists. They're, in my humble opinion, they're the best in this country. Mm-hmm. I know they're not going to screw up, but what I want to see is the reaction of the audiences, and to know of that night's pieces, which one got more reaction. Sometimes you can tell, when a piece isn't really connecting, people start to get more fidgety, and you start hearing the concert program booklets starting to flip pages more. So I'm monitoring that, and so that still fuels me, and anything that I can create and produce and make happen is sort of my spinach to Popeye's diets.
Andrew, thank you so much for taking this time. I really appreciate
Pleasure.
this.
Thank you for the opportunity, and all the best with your podcast.
Thanks.